Men, women who lie effectively, aren't the ones who nervously fidget or avoid eye contact, like bad actors in movies. Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. Subtle sign. 1. Her response time changes when answering specific questions. When you ask questions and most answers come quickly, but specific questions create noticeable pauses before she responds, those pauses indicate cognitive processing time required to construct lies. Truth-telling pulls from memory and flows naturally with minimal delay. Lying requires constructing believable false narrative, which takes processing time that creates subtle but detectable delays before responses. What this sign reveals. This reveals which topics require constructed responses versus recalled truth. When someone accesses real memory, answer appears quickly because they're simply recalling what happened. When someone must construct false narrative, brief delay occurs while they formulate story. Consider what's believable, and ensure it aligns with other things they've said. The pause itself is the tell. Notice if delays appear consistently for certain topics. If you ask about her day, and she answers immediately, but questions about where she was Tuesday night create pauses before responses, Tuesday night requires constructed narrative. If most conversation flows naturally, but specific subjects create thinking delays, those subjects are ones she's lying about. Watch whether pauses seem like recall effort or construction effort. Genuine memory recall might involve pauses while someone thinks back, but those pauses feel different from pauses while someone constructs story. Construction pauses often come with slight upward eye movement as cognitive resources engage in creative narrative building rather than memory access. Pay attention to whether she fills pauses with qualifiers. If delayed responses include phrases like, "let me think," "if I remember correctly," or "I'm trying to recall," she's creating impression of memory effort when actually she's buying time for construction. Genuine recall doesn't require as much meta-commentary about the recall process. Observe whether response speed normalizes after she's established story. If first time you ask about event there's delay, but subsequent questions about same event are answered quickly, she's now pulling from the constructed narrative she created. Once lie is established, it becomes her reference point and can be accessed quickly like memory. Notice if certain people or places create consistent delays. If questions involving specific person always produce thinking pauses, that person is involved in something she's lying about. If certain locations mentioned in questions trigger delays, those locations are part of false narratives requiring construction time. Why this sign indicates lying. This indicates lying because constructing believable false narratives requires cognitive effort that truth-telling doesn't. The brief pauses before responses are the visible evidence of that cognitive load. When response times vary based on topic, varying times reveal which topics pull from memory versus which require real-time narrative construction. Subtle sign 2. She provides either too much or too little detail, based on what's verifiable. When responses to questions about unverifiable activities are filled with elaborate specific details, but responses about verifiable activities are sparse and vague, the detail distribution reveals strategic information management. Liars provide extensive detail about things you can't check to create impression of transparency, while minimizing detail about things you could verify to avoid creating checkable claims they'd need to maintain. What this sign reveals. This reveals calculated approach to information provision where detail level is determined by verification risk rather than natural recollection patterns. Truthful people provide relatively consistent detail levels across topics based on what they remember and what seems significant. Liars strategically modulate detail based on whether you could fact-check the information. Notice what gets detailed explanations versus sparse ones. If she gives elaborate description of quiet evening alone, with excessive specifics about what she watched, what she ate, what she thought about, but vague minimal description of evening with friends you could ask about, detail distribution is strategic. Unverifiable solo time gets detail. Verifiable social time gets minimized. Watch whether details are the type that create verification opportunities. If story includes many specific observations, feelings, and internal experiences, but few specific factual elements like names, places, times, or other people involved, detail selection avoids verifiable claims. Rich internal detail combined with sparse external detail reveals strategic information architecture. Pay attention to whether detail level matches event significance. If supposedly important meaningful event gets minimal description, while mundane evening gets extensive detail, distribution doesn't match natural emphasis. Sometimes extensive detail on unimportant events serves to demonstrate openness while avoiding detail on events that matter because those are the ones involving deception. Observe whether she volunteers detail or only provides it when asked. Truthful recounting often includes volunteered detail about significant elements. Strategic lying provides detail primarily for unverifiable elements to create transparency impression while requiring prompting to discuss verifiable elements and even then providing minimal information. Notice whether details serve to preempt obvious questions. If elaborate, unprompted explanations seem designed to address doubts before you raise them, detail provision is strategic rather than natural. When someone anticipates questions and builds preemptive detail into initial story, they're managing narrative strategically. Why this sign indicates lying. This indicates lying because detail distribution based on verification risk reveals conscious information management rather than natural recollection. Truth-tellers don't modulate detail based on what you can check. Liars do. Strategic detail placement that maximizes unverifiable elements while minimizing verifiable ones is signature of calculated deception. Subtle sign 3. Her baseline behavior changes when certain topics arise. When you observe her normal communication patterns and notice that specific topics create departures from that baseline, she touches her face when she normally doesn't, maintains rigid posture when she's usually relaxed, or becomes unusually still when she typically gestures, those baseline deviations indicate topics creating stress or cognitive load associated with deception. What this sign reveals. This reveals which topics create psychological or cognitive stress that manifest as behavioral changes from her normal patterns. Establishing baseline requires observing how she typically communicates when relaxed and truthful. Deviations from that baseline when specific topics arise indicate those topics require deception management that affects her behavior. Notice what her normal patterns actually are. Does she typically gesture when talking? Make certain facial expressions? Maintain specific eye contact patterns? Have particular speech rhythms? Understanding her actual baseline is essential because you're looking for departures from it, and you can't identify departures without knowing the norm. Watch what changes when specific topics appear. If she normally makes easy eye contact but suddenly breaks it when you ask about Tuesday, if she typically gestures but becomes still when certain person is mentioned, if her speech rhythm changes when you inquire about specific activity, topic-specific changes reveal topics associated with deception stress. Pay attention to whether changes are increases or decreases in baseline behaviors. Some people become more animated when lying. Others become more rigid. Neither is universal. What matters is change from her normal pattern. If she's typically expressive and becomes flat when lying, that's her tell. If she's typically reserved and becomes over-expressive, that's equally revealing. Observe whether she recognizes and tries to control tells. Sometimes when you notice behavioral change and she sees you noticing, she'll suddenly shift behavior again, trying to return to normal. This secondary adjustment, the attempt to control the tell, is itself evidence that something about the topic required deception management. Notice whether baseline returns when topic changes. If uncomfortable behavioral pattern appears during discussion of specific event but disappears when conversation moves to different topic, the connection between topic and behavior change confirms that specific topic creates stress baseline topics don't. Why this sign indicates lying. This indicates lying because deception creates cognitive load and psychological stress that manifest as behavioral changes from normal patterns. By establishing her truthful baseline and watching for departures when specific topics arise, you can identify which topics are associated with deception even without knowing specific content of lies. Subtle sign. 4. She uses distancing language. When describing events she claims to have experienced, when describing supposedly personal experiences using language that creates psychological distance, referring to herself in third person occasionally, using passive voice that removes her agency, or describing events as though she observed them rather than participated. This linguistic distancing reveals psychological separation from narrative that occurs when someone is recounting constructed story rather than lived experience. What this sign reveals? This reveals psychological distance from events being described. When people recount experiences they actually had, language reflects their direct participation and personal connection to events. When people construct false narratives about experiences they didn't have, language often includes subtle distancing because they're describing fiction, and unconsciously, their language reflects that separation. Notice if she uses I consistently versus switching to distancing constructions. If describing her evening and says, I went to restaurant, but then the food was ordered or there was a conversation, rather than I ordered or I talked with, passive constructions or third-person perspectives reveal psychological distance from supposedly personal experience. Watch for phrases that suggest observation rather than participation. If someone says it was nice versus I enjoyed it, or things happened versus I did things, descriptive language suggests watching rather than doing. When someone describes their own experience like a spectator, language reveals lack of genuine personal connection to events. Pay attention to whether she uses more qualifiers than direct statements. Phrases like, I think, I believe, probably, maybe, interspersed in supposedly factual recounting, reveal uncertainty inappropriate for describing events she supposedly experienced directly. Qualifiers hedge false claims because liar is uncertain about maintaining constructed details. Observe whether emotional language matches event descriptions. If she describes supposedly emotional experience using flat, unemotional language, if significant events are recounted with no emotional words or expressions, emotional disconnect reveals experience wasn't real. Genuine experiences carry emotional memory that bleeds into recounting. Notice whether language becomes more formal when lying. Sometimes deception creates psychological distance that manifests as more formal language structure, complete sentences where fragments would be natural, or careful word choice where casual speech would normally appear. Formality reveals conscious language management. Why this sign indicates lying. This indicates lying because distancing language reveals psychological separation from described events. You can't be distant from experiences you actually had. Linguistic distancing that creates psychological space between speaker and supposedly personal experiences reveals those experiences weren't genuinely personal. They were constructed narratives the speaker isn't truly connected to. Subtle sign. 5. She becomes defensive or redirects. When you ask for clarification. When you ask simple clarifying questions about stories she's told, and instead of simply clarifying, she becomes defensive, accuses you of not trusting her, turns the question back on you, or redirects to different topic, the defensive reaction reveals that clarification would expose inconsistencies. Truth-tellers welcome clarifying questions because they have nothing to hide. Liars avoid them because details don't actually exist beyond surface story. What this sign reveals? This reveals that story doesn't have depth beyond what she initially provided. Truthful recounting of real experiences has natural depth. You can ask follow-up questions and get answers because the experience was real and details exist in memory. Constructed lies have only the details that were initially constructed, so follow-up questions become threatening because they risk exposing the absence of deeper detail. Notice if simple clarifying questions trigger disproportionate responses. If you ask, "What time did you leave?" and get accused of interrogating her. If you inquire, "Who else was there?" and she questions why you need to know. If basic follow-ups create conflict, she's protecting shallow story from questions that would reveal its constructed nature. Watch whether she provides requested clarification or deflects from it. If you ask specific question and she answers different question, changes subject, or responds with her own question without addressing yours, deflection reveals inability or unwillingness to provide clarification. Truth-tellers simply answer. Liars deflect. Pay attention to whether she remembers clarifying details you already discussed. If you talked about event before and ask follow-up question referencing previous details, and she seems confused about what she told you, inconsistency reveals constructed story she doesn't remember clearly. Real experiences stay consistent because they're remembered. Constructed stories drift. Observe whether she turns clarifying questions into attacks on your trust. If asking, "Which restaurant was it?" becomes, "Why don't you trust me?" If seeking clarity about timeline becomes accusation that you're controlling. Weaponizing your questions prevents you from getting answers that would expose lies. Notice whether she provides more detail than requested to overwhelm. Sometimes when asked simple clarifying question, liars provide excessive information dump designed to overwhelm and confuse rather than simply answering. Information overload as response to simple question reveals avoidance through volume. Why this sign indicates lying? This indicates lying because truthful people have no reason to be defensive about clarifying questions. Real experiences can be discussed in depth because they happened and details exist. Defensive reactions to clarification requests reveal that providing requested detail would expose inconsistencies or that details simply don't exist beyond surface story. Subtle sign. 6. Her story has unusually perfect logical flow. When narrative flows too perfectly from point to point, when timeline is too precise, when details align too neatly without the natural messiness of real memory, the excessive coherence reveals constructed narrative rather than recalled experience. Real memories are messy, include irrelevant details, jump around temporally, and contain uncertainties. Perfectly logical narratives are typically rehearsed or constructed. What this sign reveals. This reveals story has been prepared rather than spontaneously recalled. When people recount real experiences, they remember things out of order, backtrack to add forgotten details, include tangential information, and demonstrate the natural disorder of how memory actually works. Constructed lies are typically more organized because their stories created with narrative structure rather than experiential memories recalled. Notice if story unfolds chronologically without backtracking. Real recounting often includes, "Oh, I forgot to mention," or "going back to earlier," because memory doesn't retrieve in perfect chronological order. If story flows A to B to C without any memory-based adjustments, it's following planned narrative structure rather than memory retrieval pattern. Watch whether details serve narrative purpose versus being random. Real memories include details that don't matter to the story. Random things noticed, irrelevant observations, tangential thoughts. If every detail she mentions serves to advance story or support particular impression without any meaningless real memory clutter, selection reveals construction. Pay attention to whether uncertainty exists. Real memory includes, I think it was around 7, or I'm not sure if it was Tuesday or Wednesday, because memory has natural uncertainty. If every detail is stated with complete certainty, if there's no natural memory, vagueness, excessive certainty suggests constructed story where everything is decided rather than recalled. Observe whether emotional progression is too smooth. Real experiences have emotional messiness. You felt one way, then something happened, and you felt different, then back to first feeling. If emotional arc is perfectly smooth narrative progression, it's story structure rather than experiential reality. Notice whether she can answer questions that jump around timeline. If you ask about end of evening, then ask about beginning, then middle, and she handles temporal jumping easily. She's working from constructed story she can access any part of. Real memory retrieval often requires working through timeline because that's how memory is stored. Why this sign indicates lying. This indicates lying because real memories aren't perfectly organized stories. Excessive coherence, perfect chronology, purposeful details, complete certainty, and smooth emotional progression are characteristics of constructed narratives rather than recalled experiences. Too perfect story reveals construction rather than recollection.